Silence is not weakness when it is sitting beside power and taking notes. At 8:17 p.m., the snow came down over Massachusetts Avenue in soft white sheets, turning the old New England campus into a postcard of money, marble, and borrowed virtue. From the 12th floor trustee lounge above Harlan Hall, the lights of Boston glowed in the distance like gold pins pressed into black velvet. Inside, the air smelled of wet wool, polished oak, white roses, and expensive coffee poured into porcelain cups stamped with the university crest. Imani Cross noticed everything. She stood near the tall arched windows in a midnight blue gown, her smooth, dark skin warmed by chandelier light, her posture calm enough to make people mistake restraint for agreement. Her wedding ring felt cool against her finger, heavier than it had that morning. 300 guests had arrived through the east entrance, past 2 security checkpoints, a valet line of black Cadillacs and Mercedes sedans, and a row of student ushers wearing navy blazers. The printed program said the evening would honor the New Vale Scholars Endowment, a billion-dollar educational fund meant to carry generations of overlooked students into law, medicine, finance, and technology. Her name was smaller than his. Conrad Vale moved through the room like a man accustomed to being framed by applause, his custom black tuxedo sitting perfectly on his shoulders and his silver cufflinks catching every camera flash. He shook hands with donors from Beacon Street, nodded to university trustees, and lowered his voice whenever a journalist leaned close, as if generosity sounded more expensive when spoken softly. At his side, Piper Ellison wore a champagne silk dress and smiled at every lens with the polished emptiness of someone who loved proximity more than purpose. She stood too close. Imani watched Piper laugh at something Conrad said, one hand resting lightly near his sleeve, not touching enough to create scandal, but close enough to create meaning. Conrad did not step away. Instead, he angled his body toward the cameras, allowing the image to form. The billionaire, the beautiful young woman in pale silk, and the wife positioned 3 feet behind them like part of the decor. That was the insult. Outside, snow pressed against the glass while the city lights blinked from distant high-rises, warm and unreachable above streets glazed with ice. Inside, a string quartet played near the staircase, and waiters in white gloves carried trays of sparkling water, smoked salmon canapes, and tiny almond cakes no one truly wanted. A university banner hung above the stage, announcing the endowment in gold letters, while a discreet folder in Imani's hand carried the real architecture behind it. Founder intent lockbox, donor misattribution trigger, fiduciary reputation breach clause, and endowment reversion protocol. Paper remembers. Conrad finally turned toward her just as Dr. Helena Ward, chair of the trustees, approached with a careful smile and eyes that knew too much. "Ready?" Helena asked. Imani felt the cold of the window through her bare shoulder, the weight of the black folder under her fingers, and the familiar ache of every late night she had spent building a scholarship he was about to claim as his own. Conrad answered before she could. "Of course we are." Then he offered Imani his arm, not like a husband seeking his wife, but like a man retrieving an accessory before stepping under brighter lights. She placed her hand lightly on his sleeve and felt nothing there worth saving. The doors opened. The ballroom doors opened into a wash of amber light, and Conrad Vale stepped through them as if the evening had been built to confirm him. The stage at the far end of Harlan Hall rose 6 feet above the marble floor, framed by white roses, navy velvet curtains, and the university seal glowing on a screen the size of a townhouse wall. At 8:29 p.m., 300 donors, faculty leaders, trustees, and scholarship finalists turned toward him while snow thickened beyond the glass and Boston's high-rise lights shimmered like coins under dark water. Imani stayed half a step behind. Conrad smiled beneath the chandeliers, warm and practiced, while in the shadow near the side aisle, Imani stood still with the black folder against her ribs. He lifted one hand toward the audience, and the room responded before he spoke, trained by years of wealth, reputation, and perfectly timed generosity. Piper Ellison moved to the first row in her champagne silk dress, crossing her ankles with deliberate elegance, her pale clutch resting on her lap like a small trophy. Dr. Helena Ward sat 2 seats away, her reading glasses folded beside the printed program, her expression so composed that only Imani could read the warning behind it. The lie was approaching the microphone. Before Conrad went on stage, Piper had leaned toward a donor and said, with a soft smile, that Imani was wonderful at supporting the vision. Imani heard it and said nothing. Conrad began with a soft laugh, a humble pause, and the easy rhythm of a man who knew exactly which camera was live. He spoke about vision, access, opportunity, and the moral responsibility of wealth, letting each word settle over the crowd like warm honey. He said the Vail Scholars Endowment had been born from a private conviction he carried for years, a belief that talent should never be trapped by circumstance. Imani did not blink. On the screen behind him, faces of students appeared one by one. A daughter of a nurse from Detroit, a first-generation law student from Queens, a young engineer from rural Georgia, a future physician from East Oakland. Imani knew their essays, their interviews, their emergency tuition gaps, their mothers' names, and the exact nights she had approved quiet bridge grants when formal disbursement schedules moved too slowly. Conrad knew the camera angle. Then he turned slightly toward her and smiled. And of course, my graceful wife, Imani, has stood beside me throughout this journey. The audience applauded, polite and full, while Piper rose first from the front row as if she had been waiting for a cue. Conrad laughed under the lights, enjoying the sound, while at the edge of the stage shadow, Imani remained motionless, her face calm enough to unsettle anyone watching closely. He continued, now bolder, describing late-night planning sessions he had barely attended and donor protections he had once dismissed as decorative legal caution. He praised the endowment's stability framework without knowing the language beneath it: founder intent lockbox, donor misattribution trigger, fiduciary reputation breach clause, scholarship name severance provision. Every term lived in the folder pressed against Imani's hand. Piper clapped too loudly. Conrad lifted the crystal award the university had prepared for him, its engraved base catching the chandelier light, and for 1 second his reflection appeared in it, distorted, stretched, almost hollow. Imani looked down at the printed program on the chair beside her, where her contribution had been reduced to 1 sentence beneath his 3-page biography. The edge of the program split quietly beneath her thumb. The only sound near her was the dry split of the heavy program stock. No one on stage heard it over the applause, but Dr. Helena Ward did. Conrad reached the emotional peak of his speech at 8:41 p.m., placing one hand over his heart as he told the students that the endowment would always carry his promise. Outside, snow covered the stone steps along Massachusetts Avenue, swallowing footprints as quickly as people made them. Inside, city lights glowed beyond the tall windows, bright above a marriage that had gone colder than the glass. Imani closed the folder clasp with a quiet click. At 8:44 p.m., the applause rose again, polished and obedient, filling Harlan Hall until the chandeliers seemed to tremble above the marble aisles. Conrad Vail stood beneath the gold light with the crystal award in his hand, laughing softly at a trustee's compliment. His face turned toward the cameras as if gratitude itself had been tailored for him. In the darker edge of the room, near the side aisle where the velvet curtain met the stone wall, Imani Crossvale lowered her eyes to the black folder and touched the brass clasp once with her thumb. The decision had already been made. Conrad smiled beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by donors and flashbulbs, while in the side shadow, Imani stood still as falling snow erased the campus paths beyond the windows. Piper Ellison stepped closer to the stage, her champagne silk dress glowing almost white in the warm light, and accepted attention that did not belong to her with the confidence of someone who had mistaken proximity for ownership. Dr. Helena Ward watched from the trustees' row, her program folded in half, her gaze fixed not on Conrad, but on Imani's hands. The founder intent lockbox had rules, and the donor misattribution trigger had just been fed every word it needed. Imani opened her small evening bag. Inside was no lipstick, no compact mirror, no nervous little object meant to help a wife survive a public evening beside a powerful man. There was only an old black fountain pen with a worn gold clip, the same pen she had bought for $18.75 at a campus bookstore years ago when she was still taking 2 buses to class and eating vending machine crackers between library shifts. She lifted it carefully. Conrad continued speaking from the stage, telling the audience that legacy was not built overnight. while Imani held the pen that had signed her first scholarship acceptance, her first graduate fellowship form, and the first private memorandum that later became the billion-dollar endowment. The contrast was almost perfect. Under the bright stage lights, Conrad performed generosity. In the quiet corner, Imani held the proof of where generosity had begun. He had the microphone. She had the origin. Imani stepped to the empty seat marked for Mrs. Vale in the front row, where the university had placed a white rose and a printed program with her name placed beneath his. She did not crush the rose, did not tear the name card, did not offer the room a scene that could be edited into gossip by morning. She placed the fountain pen across the program, exactly over Conrad's biography, letting the gold clip catch one thin line of chandelier light. The pen rolled once and stopped. Conrad saw her movement from the stage and paused for less than a second, just long enough for annoyance to pass behind his smile. As he descended after the speech, applause followed him down the steps, and Piper leaned forward as if to receive part of it. He reached Imani near the aisle, lowered his voice, and said, "Don't make this dramatic." Outside, the snow tapped against the tall glass like soft fingernails, and from the high windows, the city lights looked warm enough to forgive anything. Imani looked at him with the calm of a woman who had outgrown the need to be believed by the person who betrayed her. Revenge is loud. This is consequence. Conrad's smile held for the cameras, but his eyes sharpened. Imani turned away before he could recover the room, walked past the first row, past Dr. Helena Ward, past the marble donor wall, and into the colder corridor leading toward the old foundation offices. Behind her, Conrad laughed beneath the lights, pretending the evening was still his. Ahead of her, in the dim hallway, Imani moved without hurry, a black folder against her side and snowlight silvering the floor. The only sound was the clean click of the auditorium door closing behind her. By 8:52 p.m., the corridor behind Harlan Hall had emptied into a colder kind of silence, the kind old buildings kept after donors returned to music and warm rooms. Imani Crossvale walked past framed portraits of past university presidents, past a locked archive door, and past a narrow window where snow drifted under the blue-white glow of a street lamp on Massachusetts Avenue. 12 floors above, the trustee lounge still held the glitter of Boston's skyline, bright towers blinking beyond the winter glass. But down here the foundation wing smelled of old paper, radiator heat, leather binding, and stone that had held a century of secrets. She did not look back. In the ballroom, Conrad laughed under amber chandeliers while cameras captured him beside Piper Ellison's champagne silk smile. In the dim foundation corridor, Imani moved quietly with the black folder pressed flat against her ribs. He was still being congratulated for a gift he had not built. She was walking toward the mechanism that would remove his hands from it. At the end of the hall, Dr. Helena Ward stood beside a frosted glass door marked only with the university crest and the words Office of Donor Intent and Educational Stewardship. Helena had removed her trustee badge and folded her black coat over one arm, but her eyes were sharp, awake, and already past ceremony. "He said enough," she said. Imani nodded once. Inside the office, a green banker's lamp cast a small circle of light across a mahogany table, and on that table waited 3 sealed portfolios, 1 ivory envelope, and a silver university letter opener that had been there long before either of them. The room was simple, almost severe, but through the tall window behind Helena's desk, Boston's financial district glowed in the distance like another world selling warmth it could not deliver. Imani set down the black folder. The brass clasp opened with a sound too small for revenge and too final for forgiveness. Helena slid the first portfolio forward, Founder Intent Lockbox Certification, dated 7 years earlier, notarized before Conrad had ever been allowed to speak publicly about the endowment. Behind the elegant title, the lockbox was a restricted donor intent file, backed by trustee resolutions, naming rights conditions, and fiduciary duties no public speech could override. The second contained the donor misattribution trigger, a narrow provision written for exactly this kind of polished theft. If any public representative knowingly misstated origin, control, or founding authorship of the scholarship, all promotional naming rights attached to that representative would suspend pending trustee review. The third was sharper. Fiduciary Reputation Breach Clause. Endowment Reversion Protocol. Independent Educational Trust Transfer Authority. Perpetual Beneficiary Protection Mandate. The language did not raise its voice. It did not need to. In Harlan-Hall, Conrad lifted a glass beneath the lights, letting trustees admire his generosity. In the office's blue shadow, Imani turned a page and placed her finger beside the line that would make his applause temporary. Helena read the formal confirmation aloud, each phrase clean and cold. The billion-dollar endowment had been funded through Imani's premarital cross-family education reserve, structured through her private advisory vehicle, protected by donor intent restrictions, and administered under a governance model that Conrad had never controlled. His name had been a conditional courtesy. He had broken the condition. Imani took the pen Helena offered, not the old fountain pen she had left behind on Conrad's program, but a heavier black Mont Blanc kept for trustee resolutions. At 8:59 p.m., while music floated faintly through the walls and snow blurred the windows, she signed the activation notice that began the pre-approved endowment reversion protocol. The ink settled into the paper like a door closing underground. Then Helena placed the ivory envelope before her, the final notice addressed to Conrad Vail, Vail Philanthropic Holdings, and the University Communications Office. Imani signed again, slower this time, not because she hesitated, but because every letter of her name deserved to be seen. The only sound was the firm stroke of the pen cutting across the transfer authority line. Helena gathered the papers, pressed the university seal into warm wax, and set the official timestamp beside it. 9:01 p.m. Outside, the snow kept falling over the campus paths, covering every footprint between the ballroom and the foundation wing. Inside, Imani stood in the quiet light, no longer a wife exiting a room, but a founder reclaiming the future. At 9:08 p.m., the old foundation office seemed to shrink around the weight of what had just been signed, its green lamp glowing over sealed paper, polished wood, and the fresh imprint of the university crest in dark red wax. Above them, Harlan-Hall still carried the warmth of applause, the clink of glass, and Conrad Vail's smooth laugh moving from donor to donor like a rehearsed melody. Beyond the window, Boston's towers glittered through snowfall, bright and distant, while the campus below lay silent under a growing layer of white. Imani opened the second folder. In the ballroom, Conrad smiled beneath chandeliers with Piper Ellison glowing beside him in champagne silk. In the lower office, Imani sat in shadow and began removing the machinery he had never bothered to understand. Helena Ward placed a secure tablet on the table, its screen showing the scholarship platform's governance map, admissions outreach, emergency grant review, mentorship pairing, legal fellowship routing, donor restriction compliance, and the private algorithm Imani had commissioned to identify high potential applicants overlooked by traditional filters. Conrad had once called it administrative support. It was the engine. Imani scrolled through the ownership schedule, her fingertips steady over terms Conrad would not have recognized even if they had been printed in gold. Educational Platform Source Ownership Schedule, Beneficiary Data Stewardship Authority, Scholarship Name Severance Provision, Independent Fellowship Routing Mandate, Cross-Origin Intellectual Property Reservation, and Legacy Use Revocation Clause. None of them used loud language. All of them had teeth. Helena read the digital confirmation. The platform, selection methodology, mentorship database, and emergency tuition disbursement protocol belonged to Imani Cross's original educational trust structure, not Vail Philanthropic Holdings. The Vail name had been allowed only as a public-facing courtesy tied to ethical attribution, trustee confidence, and donor intent integrity. Conrad had mistaken permission for possession. Imani selected the transfer pathway labeled Crosslight Initiative, then paused as the new name appeared on the screen. It was not Vail, not borrowed, not softened by marriage or polished for billionaire society. It was Cross, the name she had carried when she studied under broken fluorescent lights, counted quarters for bus fare, and promised herself that no brilliant girl would be left outside a locked door because no one powerful could see her. She approved the activation documents for the dormant Crosslight Initiative, a standby educational trust she had formed years earlier for the exact moment the mission needed protection. In the ballroom, Conrad lifted another glass and accepted another compliment about vision. In the quiet office, Imani moved the source code, governance rights, and beneficiary protections into a structure built under her own name. Helena slid over the final authorization for the Crosslight Initiative, its mission statement printed on heavy cream paper: to fund, mentor, and protect women from under-resourced communities entering law, medicine, finance, engineering, public policy, and technology. The founding reserve was listed at $1 billion, with an additional $72 million liquidity buffer for emergency grants and fellowship bridge funding. The address was not Conrad's headquarters, not a glass tower with his initials in the lobby, but a modest stone building on Brattle Street, 8 miles from the university and 5 blocks from the public library where Imani had once prepared for scholarship interviews. She signed her maiden name first, Imani Cross. The only sound was the soft drag of ink across the founding resolution. Helena countersigned at 9:16 p.m., then removed the old Veil-branded cover sheet from the portfolio and placed it face down on the table. The paper made a flat, final sound against the wood. Imani did not smile. She watched Helena attach the new Crosslight seal, a small silver mark shaped like an open doorway, and felt the first clean breath of the night into her chest. Outside, snow kept falling over Massachusetts Avenue, erasing tire tracks, softening stone steps, and turning the campus lamps into blurred halos. Inside, the future stopped wearing Conrad's name. At 9:23 p.m., the first email left the Office of Donor Intent and Educational Stewardship with no music, no announcement, and no mercy hidden inside its courtesy language. It went to 12 trustees, 6 university council addresses for donor-advised fund representatives, and 2 scholarship oversight auditors. Upstairs, the communications director was still holding a press release that no longer matched the truth. Outside, snow thickened over Massachusetts Avenue until the black cars along the curb looked softened and anonymous, while the city lights beyond the upper windows kept shining as if money could warm anything it touched. Imani watched the sent confirmation appear. Upstairs, Conrad kept his smile alive beneath the chandeliers, his crystal award held at his side while Piper Ellison tilted her champagne silk dress toward every camera. In the lower foundation office, Imani stood in the blue shadow as the endowment's public authority began separating from his name, while the formal asset transfer moved into its pre-cleared trustee sequence. The first call came 3 minutes later. Helena Ward's desk phone glowed. Then the trustee emergency line flashed. Then a private number from Vail Philanthropic Holdings appeared on the secure tablet. Helena did not answer any of them. She opened the automated governance dashboard and read each status change aloud with the even voice of a judge reading weather. Vail naming rights suspended, donor origin review activated, scholarship communications frozen, external partner notification released, fiduciary reputation audit pending. Conrad's empire had not fallen yet. It had lost its halo. Upstairs, the university president stood near the dessert table holding a porcelain cup he had forgotten to drink from, his smile stiffening as his chief counsel whispered into his ear. A senior donor from Beacon Street lowered her phone, looked across the room at Conrad, and stopped clapping in the middle of a conversation. 2 student fellows near the back row refreshed their inboxes and saw the subject line: Governance Update regarding the Vail Scholars Endowment. The temperature changed without the thermostat moving. Conrad was still smiling under gold light, still letting Piper stand close enough to be photographed as part of the evening's triumph. While in the quiet office below, Imani read the first reply from a donor who had known the truth for years and wrote only 7 words: "We will follow Mrs. Cross's lead." Helena printed the official trustee notice on heavy university letterhead. The page emerged slowly, line by line, replacing Conrad's carefully staged mythology with administrative fact. The notice cited the donor misattribution trigger, the fiduciary reputation breach clause, the scholarship name severance provision, and the independent educational trust transfer authority, each term so precise it left no room for emotional interpretation. The only sound was the printer drawing the final page into the tray. At 9:31 p.m., Conrad finally felt the room turn. A trustee who had praised him 10 minutes earlier stepped away to take a call. The communications director moved toward him with a face trained to remain neutral and eyes that had already surrendered. Piper leaned close and whispered something that looked like concern from a distance. But Imani knew women like Piper never feared harm to people, only harm to optics. Conrad checked his phone. One message from University Council sat at the top of his screen, followed by another from his own chief financial officer, then another from the chair of a partner law school, suspending tomorrow's joint announcement. His thumb stopped moving. Downstairs, Imani removed her wedding ring. Not with anger, not with performance, but with the same composure she had brought to every serious signature of her life. She placed it beside the old veil-branded cover sheet, where it looked smaller than the lie it had once decorated. The ring struck the table with a soft gold tap. Outside, the snow erased the last visible footprints between the auditorium and the foundation wing, and the city lights shimmered beyond the glass like a promise made to someone else. Upstairs, Conrad searched the room for his wife and found only the space where she had stopped being useful to his story. Downstairs, Imani Cross stood beside the Crosslight Initiative seal and let the silence do what applause never could. At 9:39 p.m., the warmth inside Harlan Hall began to fail in ways no guest could name, though the chandeliers still burned gold and the string quartet still played near the staircase. Conrad Vale stood beside the dessert table with his Crystal Award in one hand and his phone in the other, reading the same governance notice for the third time, as if a different meaning might appear if he stared long enough. Piper Ellison hovered near his shoulder in champagne silk, her smile thinning each time another donor looked away from them instead of toward them. The room had learned something. Conrad still tried to laugh beneath the lights, answering questions with polished fragments about administrative clarification and routine trustee procedure. While in the quiet foundation office below, Imani Cross watched the donor dashboard shift from Vale Philanthropic Holdings to Crosslight Initiative with no change in her breathing. He was performing control. She was holding it. At 9:44 p.m., the chair of the partner law school sent a formal pause notice, freezing a $120 million public policy fellowship until the fiduciary reputation audit could be completed. 3 minutes later, a women's medical college issued a conditional redirection notice for its pledged $38 million matching fund to Crosslight Initiative under the Perpetual Beneficiary Protection Mandate. By 9:51 p.m., 6 external partners had updated their internal records, removing Conrad's name from upcoming scholarship materials and listing Imani Cross as founder of record. His phone would not stop lighting up. Piper leaned closer, her perfume cutting through the room's smell of coffee, roses, and cooling pastry, and whispered that perhaps they should leave before the cameras caught the wrong expression. Conrad looked at her as if he had only just realized she did not know what an endowment was beyond the size of the number attached to it. "This can be contained," he said. It could not. Across the room, Dr. Helena Ward entered through the side doors, her black coat dusted with snow, her face calm enough to silence 3 conversations before she spoke. She did not approach Conrad first. She went to the university president, handed him a sealed copy of the trustee notice, and waited while he read the first page under the chandelier light. The president's mouth tightened on the second paragraph. The only sound near him was the crisp tear of the old press release being folded in half and placed inside his jacket. In the foundation office, Imani signed the final partner routing authorization, transferring mentorship operations, emergency grant approvals, and applicant data stewardship to Crosslight's secure governance system on Brattle Street. The screen displayed one cold line: Legacy Use Revocation Clause completed. Upstairs, Conrad's smile cracked only at the edges, but Piper saw enough to step back. She asked whether the university could still keep the stage banner up for the photographs, whether tomorrow's society pages would still mention her name, whether this situation would make people think she had attached herself to a man losing influence. Conrad stared at her. At last, the empty part of her became useful because it said aloud what everyone else was too polite to say. She had wanted the glow, not the storm. Outside, snow swept sideways across Massachusetts Avenue, blurring the red taillights of departing cars and softening the stone steps beneath a clean white silence. From the tall windows, Boston's high-rise lights shimmered above the campus like a separate country where powerful men were still allowed to believe their names could outrun paper. Under the ballroom lights, Conrad remained visible to everyone and protected by no one. In the lower office, Imani stood in shadow beside the Crosslight seal, watching the last partner confirmation arrive. The empire did not collapse with shouting. It slipped out of his hands through clauses he had once dismissed. At 10:02 p.m., The university communications director removed Conrad's speech card from the podium and replaced it with a blank statement sheet. The card bent under her fingers before she tucked it into a folder marked Review. Downstairs, Imani closed the tablet. The only sound was the magnetic cover sealing shut over the activated transfer file. 7 years after the audit, the public correction, and the quiet migration of most serious partners to Crosslight, Snow returned to the same New England campus at 7:06 p.m. With the patience of something that had witnessed everything and judged nothing aloud. Harlan Hall had been renewed since that winter night, its marble polished brighter, its velvet curtains replaced, its chandeliers cleaned until each crystal threw warm light across the faces of women who had once been told their ambitions were too expensive. Beyond the 12th-floor windows, Boston's high-rises glittered through the falling snow, their offices lit like gold boxes stacked against the black sky, beautiful and distant above streets glazed with ice. Imani Cross arrived without needing an introduction. She wore a deep wine-colored gown under a cream wool coat, pearl earrings at her ears, and the same calm expression that had once made trustees confuse silence with permission. Around her, 200 Crosslight fellows stood in navy evening coats, black dresses, tailored suits, and borrowed shoes polished until they reflected the chandelier light. They were lawyers now, engineers, medical residents, policy analysts, founders, daughters of nurses, mechanics, janitors, immigrants, cafeteria workers, and women who had learned to walk into rooms that were never designed for them. The room belonged to them. On the stage, the banner no longer carried Conrad Vale's name, and no one seemed to miss it. It read Crosslight Initiative Annual Fellows Convocation, with a silver open-door seal above the words Founder of Record, Imani Cross. Dr. Helena Ward stood at the lectern, older by 7 winters, steadier than ever, holding a single cream card instead of a folder thick with damage control. She did not dramatize history. The woman who built this scholarship never needed applause to prove she built it. In the back row, Conrad Vale sat alone beneath the balcony shadow, his once perfect confidence softened by time, his dark suit still expensive but no longer able to protect him from memory. 7 years earlier, he had laughed under chandeliers while Piper Ellison shone beside him in champagne silk. Tonight, beneath the same kind of lights, Imani stood at center stage while he remained in the darkness, watching a legacy continue without his permission. He had once held the microphone. She now held the institution. Imani stepped to the lectern at 7:14 p.m., and the hall quieted so completely that the snow against the windows seemed audible. She spoke about bridge grants paid within 48 hours, about 1,842 women funded across 31 states, about $287 million allocated to law, medicine, finance, engineering, and public policy fellowships, and about the cross-origin intellectual property reservation that protected the platform from ever being repackaged as a billionaire's vanity project again. Her voice was low and clear. On the first row, a young woman from East Oakland pressed a tissue to her eyes, not from weakness but from recognition. On the side screen, the governance report displayed precise terms: Beneficiary Data Stewardship Authority, Independent Fellowship Routing Mandate, Perpetual Beneficiary Protection Mandate, and Legacy Use Revocation Clause completed. No one in that room needed a man's surname to understand power. The only sound was Imani placing the new Crosslight Founders pin on the podium, silver against oak, small enough to fit in her palm and strong enough to outlive a marriage. Conrad lowered his eyes when the fellows rose for her, not because the applause was loud, but because it was clean. Piper's name had vanished from society columns years earlier, fading the moment proximity stopped producing attention. Conrad's charitable empire had survived as an office, a logo, and a handful of cautious partnerships, but the moral center had moved 8 miles away to Brattle Street and never returned. Outside, snow softened Massachusetts Avenue again, covering tire marks and old footprints with the same quiet mercy it had offered that first night. Inside, city lights burned beyond the high windows, warm above a room where cold history had finally been renamed. Imani looked across the hall, saw Conrad in the shadow, and did not look away. She was not angry. She was free. At 7:58 p.m., after the Crosslight Fellows had taken their photographs beneath the silver open-door seal, Imani Cross stepped out through the side entrance of Harlan Hall into the same winter air that had once carried her away from humiliation. Snow fell softly over Massachusetts Avenue, gathering on the stone railings, the black iron lamps, and the quiet line of cars waiting beyond the curb, while Boston's high-rise lights shimmered above the campus like distant windows into lives that had never touched the cold. Behind her, the convocation continued in warm gold light, full of women laughing, crying, exchanging cards, and stepping into futures built from a billion-dollar endowment that Conrad Vale had once tried to claim as his own. The promise had been kept. Conrad waited near the old library steps, alone beneath a lamp glazed with snow, his expensive coat buttoned high, and his face older than the photographs still circulating on old charity websites. 7 years had taken the sharpness from his certainty, leaving behind something quieter, smaller, and almost honest. He did not bring Piper, counsel, cameras, or a communications advisor. For the first time Imani could remember, Conrad Vale arrived without an audience. She stopped 6 feet away. He looked toward the hall, where the city lights reflected in the tall windows and the silhouettes of crosslight fellows moved like living proof behind the glass. He said he had watched every report, every fellowship announcement, every university partnership that moved under her name instead of his. He said the night he took credit for her scholarship had become the line his life divided around, before the applause and after the truth. Imani listened without softening. Conrad admitted that he had called her graceful because he was afraid to call her brilliant, that he had placed Piper near the stage because vanity felt easier than accountability, and that he had mistaken public praise for real legacy. His voice did not break, but it thinned when he spoke of the endowment. He understood now that she had not moved money to punish him. She had moved the billion-dollar endowment to protect the students, the mission, the founder's intent, and every woman whose future should never depend on a man's appetite for recognition. That was the part the title had promised, and that was the part history remembered. He had taken credit for her scholarship. She had quietly moved the billion-dollar endowment beyond his reach. Imani looked at him, and for a moment the years between them felt less like anger and more like distance measured in documents, classrooms, signatures, and young women walking through doors that once stayed closed. She told him she had forgiven him long ago, not because what he did was small, but because carrying him would have made her smaller. She said forgiveness was not a restoration clause, not a naming right, not a pathway back into a life he had chosen to dishonor. Conrad asked if there was any version of the future where they could begin again, not as a public couple, not as a brand, just as two people who finally understood the cost. The snow tapped against Imani's cream coat, and behind her, Harlan Hall glowed with the work of her real life. She thought of the fountain pen left on his program, the ring placed beside the veil cover sheet, the crosslight seal pressed into paper, the first fellow who called to say she had been accepted to law school, and the hundreds after her. Some endings are not punishments. They are permissions. Imani stepped back toward the open doors, toward warmth, toward the women waiting inside, toward the institution she had built from silence and consequence. Conrad remained under the lamp, finally outside the story he had tried to own. Imani gave him one last look and said, "Not anymore." And for the first time, the silence belonged only to her. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.